Hi, I'm Zach Singerman, and welcome to the Gen Z Jews Learning from Leaders series. In this series, I'm interviewing leaders on the topics of anti-Semitism, Israel, and leadership. Today we have a very special guest, best-selling author, I'm so sorry, I messed it up again.
Don't worry, Zach. We have the time to get it right. Just take a deep breath and do it easy. That's what my father used to tell me when I would kind of trip up in public speaking. So have a go.
Hi, I'm Zach Singerman, and welcome to the Gen Z Jews Learning from Leaders series. In this series, I'm interviewing leaders on the topics of anti-Semitism, Israel, and leadership. Today we have a very special guest, best-selling New York Times author Yossi Klein Halevi. He has written 4 books as well as numerous articles as an award-winning journalist, the latest of which is a letter to My Palestinian Neighbors, where in a series of letters he explains what motivated him to leave the U.S. and move to Israel to participate in drama of the renewal of a Jewish homeland, which he is committed to succeed as a democratic state in the Middle East. Mr. Klein Halevi, I'm honored that you are joining me here today.
Well, Zach, it's a pleasure. You can call me Yossi. That works.
So, in my Learning from Leaders series, I'm trying to create a library for Gen Z, but also by interviewing Yossi here during the ceasefire in May 2021 between Israel and Gaza, there are definitely other things we have to talk about right now. So I did also want to delve into some current events today.
Great. Okay.
So first, some background. So before we go into details, could you provide an overview for Gen Z about why you moved to Israel and how you have devoted your life to peace?
I moved to Israel in 1982. I was 29 at the time. The only surprise for me was that I didn't move earlier, that because of different circumstances in life, I found myself delaying moving to Israel. And the reason that I say that I always knew that I wanted to move to Israel was, first of all, because I grew up in a Holocaust survivor family, and Israel was really the center point of our Jewishness, of our hope, of our family's sense that we could find our place as individuals and as a people in this world, despite what had just happened to the Jews, because there was now a Jewish state. So it was the determining factor in my Jewish identity and in my optimism. Israel gave us this sense that that good things can happen in the world. And the reason that I felt so drawn to living in Israel was because I felt that Israel belonged to all of us, all Jews around the world. I wanted to be part of it. Jews had waited for 2,000 years to return home, and it had happened just before I was born. I was part of a generation. I was the first generation that was born into Israel as a reality. How could I not be here? How could I be anywhere else as a Jew? And so that's why I say that the only surprise for me was that I waited till I was almost 30 before finally coming.
So, in your latest book, it's kind of like the first attempt by an Israeli author to directly address the Palestinian neighbors and describe how the conflict appears through Israeli eyes. Why do you think that this book was necessary, not just for Israelis and Palestinians, but for the world as a whole?
Well, it's a great question. And, my primary audience for this book, obviously, were my Palestinian neighbors, followed closely by people in the Arab world. And the book was translated into Arabic and put online for free downloading in Arabic. I also really hoped that young American Jews would read the book. And the way that I put it for myself was that they would eavesdrop on this conversation that I was having with my neighbors. And the reason for that, and this I think is a way of answering your question, because young American Jews were my second primary audience for this book. The reason that I was so keen on reaching young American Jews is because many of the questions that I try to address in this book, the meaning of Jewish identity, of Jewish peoplehood, how Judaism isn't only a religion, we're a people, and what does it mean to have a connection as a people to a particular land. These were issues that I felt strong need to try to explain to my Palestinian neighbors about. But I felt that many young American Jews have a similar need to understand these issues in a deeper way. And so the book really, in the end, functions on two levels. It is an attempt to create a respectful disagreement with Palestinians about basic contradictory narratives between us. And at the same time, an attempt to help young American Jews navigate not only the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also their own Jewish identity.
Now, while listening to critics about Israel today, it seems that they tend to forget Hamas is a terrorist organization. And people also, like critics of Israel, but also people in general, just seem to focus on Israel rather than any other place in the world. Why do you think this mindset of seeing Israel as a terrorist organization and then Hamas as the good guys, basically, how do you think that's created?
I think you've touched on two of the major problems that we're facing in trying to explain Israel's situation. The first is a simplistic understanding of Hamas as being the victim and not as being an essential part of the problem. And the second is really in some way downplaying Israel's case, downplaying Israel's dilemmas, and so minimizing the context of the conflict. That's really what's happening here. And Zach, I think that part of the problem is the nature of this moment culturally. We have a rising simplistic worldview on large parts of the left, progressive woke left, where everything is reduced to slogans. And then we have a social media which is taking the role that the more established media once played. And in social media is made for those kinds of easy judgments. And so this convergence of a woke mentality with a superficial media is disastrous to a serious conversation. And this, if you think about the Palestinian case and the Israeli case, the Palestinian case can be conveyed in 4 or 5 words, and I don't believe these words are true. Not all of them, anyway. Some of them are, some of them aren't. Occupation, that's true. The cleansing, that's not true. Apartheid, absolutely not true. But those are very easy assimilable ideas. They're buzzwords. You just throw the words out. They fit on a tweet, and they even fit in TikTok, and you just get it out. On our side, we have a very complicated case to make. We accepted UN partition in 1947, and the Palestinians didn't. As soon as you start talking about 1947 in the age of social media, you're finished. You're a dead duck. It's like the other side is speaking about apartheid, and you're talking about 1947. And yet there's no other way that we can tell our story. And I think this is really part of a certain disconnect that the Jewish people has with the rest of the world, especially at this moment. The Jewish story is very complicated. We're a complicated people. We tell our story in complicated ways. We argue about everything. That kind of Jewish discourse, which is traditionally associated with the Beit Midrash, the study hall. That kind of discourse is another language in the era of social media. So we're speaking Jewish, and the Palestinians are speaking TikTok. You know, it's the Beit Midrash versus TikTok. And in the era of social media, the Beit Midrash doesn't have a chance. I will not give up the Beit Midrash. I believe we have to fight on TikTok. I believe we need to do that. And it's your generation, Generation Z, that is going to have to fight this war in social media, and is going to have to really try to figure out how do you be deeply Jewish, deeply rooted in a complex story, and still manage to effectively fight on social media. It's a very complicated job your generation has. My job really had a much easier. My generation had a much easier job, which was to explain a complicated story in a complicated way. Sometimes we did it better, sometimes less well. But those were tools that made sense for our story. And your generation has a much harder job.
Now, over the last week, there's been a lot of anti-Semitism towards Jews in the United States because of the situation in Israel. Why do you think, how do you think, actually, that the idea that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism at this point is still an idea that stands strong in people's minds?
It's a great question, Zach. And I think that the onus increasingly is on the anti-Zionists to prove that they're not anti-Semitic, rather than for Jews to have to prove that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. When we see the consequences of anti-Zionism, it sure looks and smells like anti-Semitism. And so, you know, as you said earlier, when you single out Israel for unique treatment, and Israel becomes the overriding problem for world peace, for justice, then I think the burden of proof is on the anti-Zionists. Explain to me exactly how that's not anti-Semitism. I don't feel I need to prove that it is.
As an American Jew, white supremacy is becoming an increasingly pressing issue with QAnon and the attack on the Capitol in January. But for Gen Z, when we go to college, we're going to confront anti-Semitism in the form of BDS. And it's becoming more legitimate to express anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And I think my question is, what advice do you have to Gen Z to respond to this kind of anti-Semitism?
I think that, again, your generation has a much tougher fight on its hands than my generation did. I grew up in the United States. I went to college in the U.S., and we had our battles on campus, but it was nothing like the atmosphere today. I'll give you an example. I went to journalism school at Northwestern. This was 1978. And Menachem Begin had just been elected Israel's prime minister, and Northwestern gave him an honorary degree. He came to campus. And for weeks before Begin came, there was an organized anti-Israel campaign to try to stop his appearance. And I helped organize a welcoming committee and a counter campaign. And we had tremendous support, both among students and faculty. A majority of the students and faculty of journalism school signed on to an ad that we put into the campus paper, welcoming the prime minister of the only country in the Middle East with a free press. Now, that would be inconceivable today. You would never get that kind of broad support on campus for that kind of a pro-Israel initiative. So your generation's job is really, really much harder. I think that the way in which you need to defend Israel and defend the Jewish story, because that's really what's under assault, is our story, is on the one hand by being unapologetically proud of our story. It's a 4,000-year story, and in the 20th century, the move of the Jewish people from the lowest point, from 1945 to one of the peak places in Jewish history where we are today. This is an extraordinary story that we need to be proud of, and it's that story, exactly that story, that's under attack. But that's only half of it. The other half is we need to be reaching out. We need to be reaching out to anyone in the Muslim world who is ready to speak with us, not to agree with us, but to engage us in conversation. And that's what I tried to do with my book. And in the paperback edition of Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, I have a 50-page epilogue of responses from Palestinians, and I chose to end the book with those responses, to give Palestinians the last word in my book, because I wanted to honor the Palestinians who responded to me, but more deeply, I wanted to model what a respectful conversation would be like. And so, on the one hand, defend our story, own the story, be proud of the story, love the story. On the other hand, make space for the counter story, because in the 21st century discourse on Israel, there's no other way, especially on campus.
Mm-hmm. And how you talked about, like, you wanted to end the book by having, like, an example of what a normal conversation is, and having, like, a civil conversation. It seems like that's such, like, a difficult thing to find today, you know?
Oh, I'll tell you a story. I was just today. I was interviewed on CNN, and I was supposed to do the event with a Palestinian journalist. And ordinarily, I would have no problem doing that. We can disagree. We can even disagree strongly. But the atmosphere today is so poisonous that I knew it would just end up being a shouting match. And I didn't see any purpose to that. So I told the producer, look, I'll do this interview, but don't put us on together. It's just going to be a food fight. And have us on consecutively. And so they did. But that's an indication of what you're saying, of just how difficult it is to have a civil conversation today. These things tend to be cyclical, and we will have hopefully calmer periods where we can begin to conceive of a different kind of conversation, but that's certainly not the case at this moment.
Now, last week you wrote an op-ed where you said, while fighting Hamas is unavoidable, reclaiming Jewish property is not. Could you explain kind of what this means and expand upon it a little?
Yeah, I was referring to the very famous or infamous incident in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, where where 6 Palestinian families have gotten eviction notices from an Israeli court, which ruled that this was property that belonged by right to Jews before the 1948 war. And my response was that it's true that property did belong to Jews who were expelled, and in the 1948 war by Jordan, that property was confiscated and given to Palestinians. But at a time when Israel is fighting very brutal, difficult, asymmetrical wars against terrorists who are embedded in civilian populations, And those conflicts create very hard scenes. At a time like that, Israel needs to be especially careful not to provoke, not to be seen as acting unjustly, and not to act unjustly. If we don't allow Palestinians to reclaim property that they lost in the 1948 war, we shouldn't be allowing Jews to do that. And so I believe very strongly there should be a freeze on all property claims resulting from the 1948 war. And so that's why I wrote.
And just to wrap us up, is there anything else you would like to say to Gen Z?
Yeah, that your generation has really been handed a very difficult hand. I'm really sorry for that. I feel that my generation should apologize to your generation for this mess that you need to confront, or that you will be confronting every day. Some of you on campuses, certain campuses in particular. And so the first thing is really an apology, and the second is to say to you that this is your moment in Jewish history, and I know that people like you, Zach, are going to step up to the plate, and you already have, and here you are. And I was so touched to get your email and your invitation to appear on your podcast. You're starting exactly when you should be starting, which is in high school, and getting yourself ready and becoming educated, finding your voice. And I want to just wish you much strength and success in the leadership role that you've just taken on. And anything I can do to help you, you know how to reach me.
Well, thank you so much, Yossi, for coming on today and speaking.
Pleasure. Great to meet you, Zach.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.